Hello, everyone. My name is Fiona Drummond, and I will be presenting a paper on supporting freelance creative careers recommendations from South Africa in the wake of COVID-19. This is a part of my PhD research at Rhodes University in South Africa. So before we begin, I will just define what freelancers are in this case. They are individuals who do not work for a permanent employer, so they take on contract work with clients to whom they offer their skills, services, and expertise on a project. This type of work is particularly prevalent within the cultural and creative industries because of the project-based mode of production, where we tend to get groups of skilled creatives coming together to work on a project, and then once completed, they will move on to the next project. The projects also require a number of different skills, and so having the ability to bring together diverse groups of people is particularly advantageous. There are particular advantages and disadvantages of this type of production and freelancing for creative labor. So, for example, as a freelancer, you may enjoy the opportunity of flexible hours, autonomy over the projects you take on and who you work for, the passion you have for creative work, and job satisfaction. However, this type of work is also precarious because freelancers do not receive social security like their permanent employee counterparts. So, for example, they do not receive unemployment benefits. They may not receive healthcare from an employer or pensions. They are responsible for doing this for themselves. They also have limited protections for working conditions linked to things like wages, hours worked, and health and safety. This type of precarious work was exposed and compounded by COVID-19. So though it was present before the pandemic, it has certainly now been exposed and compounded. So we can use this as a moment of opportunity to recalibrate and introduce new support measures for long-term change to the industry. For a bit of context of the cultural and creative industries in South Africa, in the pre-pandemic, they were termed South Africa's new gold. This is because of their potential to create job opportunities and to spur economic growth. However, the COVID-19 pandemic was particularly bad for South African culture and creative industries because we had such a strict lockdown. So there was a 50% fall in GDP from 2019 to 2020, and 85,000 cultural jobs were lost in 2020, though we did start to see a slow recovery from 2021 onwards when COVID restrictions started to ease. If you have a look at the figure there, using the UNESCO definition of cultural and creative industries, you will see that each domain experienced a negative growth rate in 2020, though this is variable. So those that were more face-to-face in terms of operation, who had a larger number of freelancers working in the sector, and also those that had larger informal economies, something that is particularly prevalent within the Global South context, were affected more negatively. For COVID relief schemes, they were offered in South Africa. However, the criteria often excluded freelancers because you had to show evidence of a formal cancelled contract or be a permanent employee. So in response to the precarious working conditions and a perceived lack of government support and understanding within the sector, there were protests. And in fact, it wasn't just in South Africa where these protests occurred. There were also high-profile protests in places like France, Italy, Argentina as well. And so both in the global North and South context there. And it really shows that there is a need for support within the sector. So moving on to the research question, the objective was to investigate potential support strategies for cultural and creative workers and the sector going forward at the government and industry level. So 3 UNESCO domains were selected because of their variations in face-to-face production and their use of technology pre-pandemic. And so the 3 domains were performance and celebration, visual arts and crafts, audiovisual and interactive media. And a mixed methods approach was used. So there were 11 interviews and 7 focus groups with key stakeholders amounting to 49 participants. And in this case, the key stakeholders included people like festival organizers, artists, freelancers themselves, representatives of industry bodies, gallery curators, film and TV producers, studio heads, and researchers. A thematic analysis was conducted for this qualitative component. And then there was also an online survey of creative freelancers themselves for the quantitative component, where a statistical analysis was conducted. In this case, only 86 responses were received from the survey, so they indicate the key trends, and it's not a representative sample. So in this survey, respondents were asked to rate the usefulness of different types of support on a scale of not at all useful to essential. So I've just pulled out some of the key things that were highlighted in that survey. So firstly, in terms of skills, business skills training came out as particularly important because as a freelancer, you are essentially operating as a one-person business and representing yourself. So you may have the creative skills, but the business skills may be lacking. There is also a gap between creative skills training and being industry ready for some types of activity. This was particularly for the animation industry. So though graduates leave with the creative skills, they are not yet ready to be working in that industry. So things that to help with that include work integrated learning, as well as mentorship programs and internships. Then, of course, with COVID-19, there was a pivot to online ways of working across the board. And so continuing to have support in developing online tools and skills was seen as particularly important. In the cultural and creative industries, networks are particularly important. This is how many freelancers get work opportunities. And so facilitating networking events and having platforms for freelancers to network both amongst themselves and with clients was seen as an important support strategy. In terms of infrastructure, South Africa is a country within the global south, and so fast and reliable broadband was seen as important. And of course, we have problems with securing electricity. So we have what we call load shedding here, which is rolling blackouts. So freelancers to be able to work need to have access to backup or alternative electricity supply. So this is something that may not apply to the global north, but for other global south countries may also be an important aspect. Then lastly, financial. So to get a bank loan, you often have to show a payslip. And of course, freelancers do not have a payslip from a permanent employer. So this is not asking for leniency or banks to just give a loan to whoever. It is just saying that perhaps we can relook at the criteria so that it is inclusive to freelancers. If we have a look at the academic suggestions for the role of the public sector, it tends to revolve around a greater role from the government. So it comes from greater income and health security through universal basic income schemes, as well as regulatory frameworks for the sector to try and protect workers' rights and have formal representation. There have been calls for renewed recognition of the public value of culture, and so a need to have state funding for the cultural and creative industries, as well as appropriate incentives for private sector investment and the expansion of philanthropy. This is something that is done particularly well in the USA, for example, but isn't very well done in South Africa and many other countries within the global south. So really this relates to an expanded role of the government through income schemes, welfare, legislation, and funding. The problem is that many of these suggestions have come from the global north. And so the question arises as to whether they are appropriate for the global south, where we have a number of different conditions. So governments in the global south, including South Africa, often face capacity and resource constraints. As developing countries, they there are competing funding interests and developmental challenges. So the culture and creative industries may be competing with the healthcare sector, for example. And then we also have large informal creative economies, which means that it becomes quite difficult to regulate. So in the key stakeholder interviews, we discussed the role of the public sector in the Global South context, and a few suggestions were made. Firstly, in terms of funding, during COVID-19, there was a greater degree of funding provided to the sector for COVID relief, and it has been suggested that this continues. They also suggested that a larger portion of government funds was channeled towards intermediaries because they are the specialists in the industry, and so they know better what is needed. This is rather than giving it to individuals on a once-off basis. Then also a greater inclusion of private sector funding in the mix so that there is not such a reliance on the government sector, but so that there is a greater diversity. And so the role for the government here would be in strengthening tax incentives so that the private sector is more inclined to give. In terms of regulation, the pandemic exposed the weaknesses of existing cultural and labor policy in South Africa as it relates to freelancing. But unfortunately, there is a distrust of government within the sector, and so there is concern that any stricter government regulation will erode the benefits of freelance labor and will set the sector back. So this mistrust was also seen in the protests that occurred, and so this is something that is not really wanted by those in the sector. So instead of greater government regulation, what is being recommended is that there is a general expansion of definitions of employment in regulatory frameworks that includes all forms of paid work, so that it's not just permanent employees, and that there are rights for workers, not employees, so that these protections are extended to everyone. These would be relatively easy for governments in the Global South to implement and would be quite cost effective, but would make quite a change. And it's not just freelancers in the creative industries that would benefit from this, but other industries as well. There is also the opportunity for industry level support. So formal collective action was seen as particularly important. So during COVID-19, we did see the formation and strengthening of formal industry associations, as well as some new ones being formed. And in this case, there was a breaking down of silos for some cross-sector solidarity, and so that the industry could speak with one voice towards the powers that be, or the government and policymakers in this case. However, a challenge is that existing industry bodies lack capacity, both in terms of their staffing and resources. There was also informal collective action, what we are terming communities of care, to tie into the international literature, where people would offer mutual support to one another, share information, and have a platform for networking with one another. These did exist before COVID-19, but were certainly strengthened. And they were generally on social media platforms such as Facebook. This has also been found in the Global North context, but interestingly, from the Global South context, WhatsApp was particularly important for informal collective action and communities of care. Something else that has arisen is a duty of care from employers. So in this case, employers themselves supporting the sector's growth and development and supporting freelancers. It is a relationship and networking driven industry. And so in this case, it is seen as important for employers to have a good reputation, not just freelancers to have a good reputation. So in one of the interviews, a respondent said that COVID highlighted to the freelancer which producers they can trust and who actually cares for me as an individual, as opposed to just me doing my hours on the particular project. So in this case, having communities of care would also act as an informal rating system for good and bad employers, so that freelancers have more information, perhaps about who they would want to work for and what that experience may be like. In this way, a legacy of the pandemic could be the shifting of the power imbalance between freelancers and employers. There has also been some internal industry regulation, and this ties into moral creative economies and the ethics of care approach, in which there are shared values and beliefs about what constitutes fair, good, and moral working conditions and practices. So essentially the industry coming together. So in the case of South Africa, there has been an industry ombudsman for audiovisual and interactive media, so film, TV, animation, and gaming. This is something that is quite effective because it means that a freelancer, instead of having costly law costs if they have a problem with a client, can go to the ombudsman. There have also been suggestions for a standard contract template agreement and social security schemes for freelancers. This social security scheme is suggested to be for more than just creative industry, so it is freelancers more general, so that they account for how they earn an income which can be irregular. So to conclude, precarity in the cultural and creative industries is not new, but it has been exposed and compounded by COVID-19 and has thus offered a moment of opportunity for us to reflect and perhaps recalibrate and introduce measures to reduce this precarity for freelancers. Support is multifaceted, so it is not just the government's responsibility, but it's also the industry's responsibility. Scholarly recommendations of greater government support and regulation have come mainly from the global north, and while these may work there, due to the constraints faced by governments in the global south, it is questionable whether these policy recommendations are appropriate or even, in fact, realistic. Therefore, this research recommends that a partial implementation of government regulation by expanding the definition of employee to all forms of paid work and extending labor laws and general protections to freelancers is what is recommended, and that support and reform from within the sector itself could be more viable to increase resiliency and reduce precarity. It is also the case that collective action and communities of care are crucial for internal support and representation. Thank you very much for listening, and please do keep in touch with the Creative Economies cluster of research excellence through the links there.